Huffington Post has a terrific investigative story about how the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee tells the new arrivals in Congress how they have to set their schedule. Now, the reason that it's enormously relevant is because it shows you the tremendous power of money in politics, because they spend a great amount of their time fundraising. In fact, they have the documents. Here, let me show you the model daily schedule that they were given. And remember, this is the Democrats. For the Republicans, it's probably even larger. So 3 hours they have to do fundraising and call time. 2 hours there's proactive community events. Well, isn't that pleasant? 1 to 2 hours of reactive community events, and 1 hour of strategic outreach. I like that. There's 3 hours of fundraising, but only 1 hour of strategic outreach. Okay, now it gets better. Now, when they're back at home, they have a different schedule. It's 4 hours of call time, so even more fundraising, 1 to 2 hours of constituent visits. And by the way, they say in one of the notes, it's preferable if the constituents are also your donors. Well, ain't that the God's honest truth? 2 hours on the committee and floor. You know, I'm sorry, we have this inversed, actually. This is when they're in D.C. The first one was in the district. So when they're in D.C., they actually have to spend more time raising money. They do get to do 1 hour of strategic outreach, though, and 1 hour of recharge time. Well, are they not merciful? Okay, thank you so much. Now, when you get into the details, it only gets worse. You know, when they're calling, you know who they're calling, right? They're calling donors. They're dialing for dollars. And most of the people they are calling are people who are going to donate over $500. So they spend 4 hours a day when they're in Washington and 3 hours a day when they're in their back home districts talking to guys who have a lot of money and who want them to do stuff. So this is crazy. So Huffington Post explains 3 to 4 hours are designated for the actual work of being a member of Congress, hearings, votes, and meetings with constituents. If the constituents are donors, all the better. Now they continue. Congressional hearings and fundraising duties often conflict, and members of Congress have little difficulty deciding between the two. Occasionally, even raising money from the industry covered by the hearings, they skip. That's amazing. So here's a hearing. They're like, yeah, who cares about the information I'm going to get from that hearing or the questions that I would ask, etc. Instead, I'm going to go meet with a donor who cares how I vote about that hearing. Now, which way do you think they're going to vote? A lot more. They explain, it is considered poor form in Congress, borderline self-indulgent for a freshman to sit at length in congressional hearings when the time could instead be spent raising money. Self-indulgent to actually do the work of being a congressman when you should get back to your real work, which is raising money. This system is sick. It is diseased. Money has taken over the whole system. I've got much more. This is an anonymous member of Congress. He says, quote, one thing that's always been striking to me is even the members playing a leading role on specific issues actually could not talk about the issues. They didn't have enough knowledge on their own issues to talk about them at length. I'm probably guilty of that. Think about that. They're so busy raising money, they don't know what they're talking about. They get into meetings. The staffers know, it's their job to follow the legislation, etc. And he says the staffers sometimes snicker like, oh my God, this is kind of embarrassing, right? Because they're not at the hearings. They don't have time to read. Barney Frank at one point says, look, man, on that schedule, there's no time to read. I got to have at least an hour to read. This is crazy. That anonymous member of Congress continues. The members were sitting around the table having a remarkably uninformed and unproductive discussion. That's because they don't know what the hell's going on. Brad Miller, Democratic congressman from North Carolina, says, quote, any member who follows that schedule will be completely controlled by their staff, handed statements that their staff prepared, speaking from talking points they get emailed from leadership. So that's another huge problem. Since they don't have time to prepare and they're not at the hearings and they're not reading the news, the issues, the legislation, they have to do what their staff and what leadership tells them. They get handed a note and they say, okay, all right, which way am I voting? Okay, I apparently believe this. I don't know what it is, but yeah, I'm going for it. And leadership says, vote this way and I'll get more money. Okay, then I'll vote that way. Does this sound like democracy to anybody yet? The row houses, and this is fascinating, before we get back to Brad Miller. So they go to make the calls at these row houses because they can't make them in Congress because it's illegal to call for money from Congress. Now, get a load of what a joke that is, because as Huffington Post explains, the row houses are typically owned by lobbyists, fundraisers, or members themselves, and are used for call time because it's illegal to solicit campaign cash from the official congressional office. They go to a place owned by the lobbyists to raise money for their re-election. And that's better than staying in their congressional office, because if they stayed in their congressional office, it would look so bad if you raised money from there. Does this look better? Do you get a sense of what actually drives these people? If you don't, I'm going to go back to Brad Miller because he explains it very clearly. You end up being nice to people that probably somebody needs to be questioning skeptically. It's a fairly disturbing suggested schedule. You won't ask tough questions in hearings that might displease potential contributors, won't support amendments that might anger them, will tend to vote the way contributors want you to vote. This is obvious, man. If you set up a system where the main thing that gets you elected is not votes, it is money, and I've told you in congressional races, 93% of the time, the person with more money wins the election. Doesn't matter if you're a Democrat or Republican, liberal or conservative. Your ideas don't matter. The only thing that matters is money. That's why they schedule their time like this, because they go and concentrate on what is most important for their reelection. Do you know that this memo and this presentation was given to them about a week after the elections? As soon as they come in, they're like, we're not going to talk about legislation and priorities. No, I'm going to tell you how you're going to work for the next 2 years to raise money so you can get reelected 2 years from now. This system is sick. I think the whole country realizes it. That's why Congress has a 9% congressional approval rating. Yet who's doing anything about it? Where's the media outcry saying what an unbelievable corruption in our government? We continue. Huffington Post explains the quality of a committee assignment is directly related to the amount of dues owed. As black and white an admission of the connection between fundraising and policy outcomes as can be found. So it only gets worse. Not only do you have to spend the whole time doing it, not only do you go to a lobbyist place. By the way, in the Senate, sometimes they sneak out to their car and make calls for hours from their car for fundraising. Not only do you have to do all that, but you're not going to get the important committee assignments unless you raise more money. So the guys who have the most powerful positions are not the ones that represent their constituents best. They're the ones who raise the most money from rich people. Now, do you see why some of the bills that we want never get introduced? Well, we're going to have more on that in a second. Tom Perriello, another former representative from the state of Virginia, says, this helps to explain why many from very safe Democratic districts who might otherwise be pushing the conversation to the left, or at least willing to be the first to take tough votes, do not, because they get their leadership positions by raising from the same donors noted above. You get nothing for being a good guy. You get nothing for representing your voters. But if you represent the donors, you get great committee assignments, you get positions of power, you get to get reelected easier. So they have geared the whole system, logically so, to raising more and more money and doing the bidding of those donors. If you don't understand that, and apparently that applies for at least 90% of the people on television who cover politics and consider themselves experts. This is not just one of the things that drives politicians. Again, they almost never mention it on TV. This is the primary thing that drives politicians. Look at their schedule and you could tell. This is the destruction of our democracy. Does anybody in their right mind, seeing their schedule, seeing anonymous members of Congress currently, former members of Congress talking about this, think, oh, no, they probably don't listen to those donors they spend half the day with. They probably listen to their voters anyway. You would have to be ridiculously naive to believe that. Finally, there is one silver lining, which is that this is so oppressive. Perriello, for example, says 4 hours is a conservative estimate. They probably told the new members that just so they don't scare them away. There's a Republican congressman, for example, Reed Ribble from Wisconsin, who say, look, I spent an hour and a half on the phones, but, you know, he's been in Congress for a little bit. He said, if I have to spend 4 hours a day, I don't want this job, but you'd be nuts to want this job. And then we go to Congressman John Larson from Connecticut. He says, it's the most painful thing about raising money. And they're no sooner elected, and they're down there making phone calls for the election in 2014. And this is our advantage, because these guys, yes, they use it to gain their position, but they hate this system too. In fact, here's the final quote from John Larson. What's my experience with it? You might as well be putting bamboo shoots under my fingernails. So that leads us to our only possible solution. We have to get a constitutional amendment that detaches fundraising from legislation, from these politicians. If we do public financing of elections, you know, conservatives from time to time will say, oh no, my God, we'll spend more money on these politicians. No, we'll spend less money. Because then these guys won't give away billions and trillions of dollars to their donors to get reelected. So that way they'll actually be congressmen, they'll actually be representatives, because the people who got them elected will be us and not their donors. And then we have to take away corporate personhood, because if you think corporations are not driving the unlimited money here, again, you are foolishly naive. They're the ones with the most amount of money, and they're the ones that the congressmen listen to the most. We've got to do an amendment, but the upside is, if an amendment gets enough momentum, a lot of these guys who are exhausted from this fundraising are going to get to a point where they're going to break. And they're going to say, you know what, I don't want those bamboo shoots under my fingernails anymore. Fine, you win. Let's actually get the money out of politics. And as incumbents, they'll have huge advantage anyway because of name recognition. So that's a structural advantage for us. We've got to do everything in our power to make sure that we change this system. Otherwise, we will be ruled by moneyed interest for the rest of time. We have already lost our democracy. We've got to gain it back. You know how we think we should do it. It's wolf-pac.com. You can read the 28th Amendment we propose for yourself on that website, and you could volunteer or you could donate. We're doing matching donations this month up until January 21st, the Citizens United anniversary, because I'm sick of these stories. I want to cover actual politics. I want to cover actual ideology and policy debates. I want to live in a democracy. We should all be sick to death of this, whether you're Democrats or Republicans. Let's fight back and let's win.